They said the river could not be tamed, that the sheer force of the Atlantic tides rushing between the boroughs would snap any chain and crumble any stone. Yet it was the silence of a frozen morning that changed the skyline of America forever. It begins in the winter of 1867, a winter so severe that the salt spray of the East River froze in midair before it could hit the wooden decks of the ferries. New York City was not yet the vertical metropolis of glass and steel we know today. It was a sprawling, smoky creature of brick, iron, and brownstone, huddled low against the earth. On this particular morning, the city was paralyzed. The East River, the violent artery separating the booming independent city of Brooklyn from the crowded bustle of Manhattan, had solidified into a jagged plain of ice. Commuters wrapped in thick wool and tweed stood stranded on the docks. Their breath misted in the frigid air, mingling with the gray coal smoke that hung low over the harbor. The ferries, usually the lifeline of commerce, were trapped, their paddle wheels useless against the crushing grip of the ice floes. Men looked at their pocket watches, the ticking of the gears, the only sound in the white silence, while horses stamped their hooves nervously on the cobblestones, their breath steaming like dragons in the cold. It was in this moment of stillness, of frustration and frozen isolation, that the impossible idea truly took root in the mind of John Augustus Roebling. He was a man of discipline, a German immigrant with eyes that seemed to measure the world angles and stress loads. While others saw only the ice and the inconvenience, Roebling saw geometry. He saw a line drawn across the sky, a sweeping curve of steel that would render the ice irrelevant. He did not just imagine a bridge, he imagined a monument that would outlast the very civilization that built it. To understand the calmness of this history, one must first sink into the atmosphere of 19th century New York. Imagine the soundscape. There were no sirens, no roar of engines, no honking horns. The city hummed with an organic rhythm. It was the clatter of iron horseshoes on granite, the rolling rumble of wooden wagon wheels, the distant, mournful whistle of a steamship navigating the fog. At night, the city did not glow with neon. It flickered. Gas lamps cast long, wavering shadows against the brick facades, creating pockets of warm amber light amidst the encroaching darkness. It was a world of tactile reality, where everything was made of wood, leather, stone, or iron. Roebling's vision was calm, precise, and absolute. He proposed a suspension bridge, but not just any suspension bridge. He spoke of utilizing steel, a material that at the time was considered unproven and suspect for such a massive undertaking. Iron was the trusted metal of the age, heavy and brittle. Steel was the future, lighter and stronger. But the American public was skeptical. They feared it would snap. Roebling, however, sat in his study, surrounded by stacks of paper and the smell of pipe tobacco, calculating the impossible. His study was a sanctuary of silence. Picture the heavy velvet curtains drawn against the Brooklyn chill, the fireplace crackling softly, the logs shifting and settling into embers. Roebling would sit for hours, his pen scratching rhythmically against the parchment. He was designing the Great Bridge, a structure that would require the largest caissons ever sunk into a riverbed, towers that would rival the pyramids in grandeur, and a web of cables that looked like a spader silk but possessed the strength of a mountain. The calmness of his process was hypnotic. He did not rush. He wrote detailed specifications for every bolt, every wire, every stone. He thought about the wind. He knew the bridge had to breathe. If the wind struck it, the bridge needed to sway just a fraction to absorb the energy rather than fight it. He designed a diagonal system of stay cables, a crisscross pattern that would not only hold the bridge up, but keep it steady in the fiercest Atlantic gales. It was a perfect harmony of physics and art. But before a single stone could be laid, there was the survey. It is soothing to imagine the early days of the survey before the noise of construction began. It was just a few men in small boats, drifting on the water on calm days. They dropped lead weights on long ropes down into the murky depths of the East River to find the bedrock. Plop! The weight would hit the water. The rope would slide through leather-gloved hands, 10 feet, 20 feet, 40 feet, down into the darkness. They were searching for the solid earth beneath the shifting sands and mud, the foundation upon which the towers would stand. The river itself was a living thing. It was tidal, meaning it reversed its flow 4 times a day. The water was dark, green-gray, swirling with the debris of a growing nation. The surveyors worked with a quiet determination, mapping the floor of the harbor, creating a topographical map of the invisible world beneath the waves. They listened to the lap of the water against the hull of their rowboats, the cry of the seagulls overhead, and the distant bells of the churches in Brooklyn Heights ringing out the hour. When the plans were finally approved, it was not with a shout, but with the heavy thud of a gavel and the scratching of signatures. The funding was immense, the risk catastrophic. Yet Roebling remained stoic. He moved his family to a house in Brooklyn Heights, overlooking the site. From his window, he could watch the river. He would stand there in the evenings, watching the sun dip below the jagged horizon of Manhattan, turning the sky into bruised purples and deep indigos. He could see the line in the air where his bridge would be. Tragedy, however, strikes even in the quietest moments. In the summer of 1869, while taking a final reading on the waterfront pilings, a ferry boat drifting into the slip crushed Roebling's foot against the wood. It was a blunt, dull trauma. There was no grand explosion, just a sickening crunch and the sudden onset of pain. He was taken to his home, to that quiet room with the view. He refused traditional doctors, relying on his own water cures. But tetanus set in. As he lay in his bed, the city continued its slow, rhythmic breathing outside his window. The fever took him slowly. In his final days, he did not scream or rage. He simply lay there, the plans of the bridge etched into his mind, drifting in and out of consciousness. He passed the torch, not with a speech, but with the silent legacy of his blueprints. His son, Washington Roebling, a Civil War veteran with the same steel in his spine as his father, sat by the bedside. The silence of the room was heavy, filled with the weight of the unfinished task. When John Roebling died, the city paused, but the dream did not. The bridge had to be built. Washington took over. He was a younger man, accustomed to the roar of cannons, but he approached the bridge with a different kind of quietude. He knew that to build the towers, they would have to go down before they could go up. They needed caissons. A caisson is essentially a massive airtight wooden box the size of a city block, turned upside down and sunk into the river. It is a masterpiece of 19th century engineering. Imagine a room made of timber, 12 feet thick, submerged underwater. To keep the water out, they pumped compressed air into it. Inside this wooden womb, deep beneath the river, men would dig. The construction of the caissons on land was a spectacle of carpentry. Shipbuilders from Maine were brought down, men who knew how to caulk seams with oakum and pitch until they were watertight. The air around the shipyard smelled of fresh pine sawdust, hot tar, and salty river wind. The hammers swung in a steady percussive rhythm, thud, 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 driving iron bolts as thick as a man's arm into the yellow pine timbers. It was a slow assembly, a layering of wood upon wood, creating a structure so solid it felt like a part of the earth itself. When the Brooklyn caisson was finally launched, it was a massive event, yet it moved with the slow, hulking grace of a glacier. It slid down the greased ways and hit the river with a slow, heavy splash that sent waves rolling across the harbor. Tugboats, puffing black smoke, latched onto it with thick hawser ropes and gently guided it to its final resting place. Now began the sinking. This is perhaps the most atmospheric part of the history. To sink the caisson, they piled limestone blocks on top of it. Heavy gray stones quarried from the distant earth, brought by barge and laid one by one. With every stone, the wooden box was pushed deeper into the mud. Inside the caisson, the atmosphere was otherworldly. To enter, the workers had to pass through an airlock, a small iron chamber where the pressure was equalized. The air inside the workspace was thick, hot, and humid. The only light came from calcium lights and candles that burned with a strange, frantic brightness due to the high oxygen levels. The shadows were long and dancing. The floor was muck, sand, clay, and boulders. The men worked in shifts, stripping to the waist, their skin glistening with sweat in the compressed air. There was no loud machinery down there, only the sound of picks and shovels striking stone, the slurping sound of the sand pumps sucking the debris up a pipe and ejecting it out into the river above. It was a subterranean world, a quiet, muffled existence separated from the sun and the sky by layers of timber and the weight of the river. They were digging toward the past. As they shoveled the riverbed, they found remnants of colonial New York. They found old ship anchors lost a century before, cannonballs from the Revolution, and prehistoric shells. They were digging through time, lowering the foundation inch by inch. The deeper they went, the higher the air pressure had to be raised to keep the river from rushing in. Washington Roebling spent more time in the caisson than anyone. He was there supervising the pouring of concrete, checking the air seals, listening to the groaning of the timbers. The wood would creak under the immense pressure of the river and the stone tower growing above it. It was a sound like a living beast, a low moan that vibrated through the bones of the men working inside. But they trusted the math. They trusted the design. Above the water, the stone towers began to rise. These were not steel skeletons. They were neo-Gothic cathedrals of granite. The stones were massive, rough-hewn blocks that absorbed the sunlight. They rose slowly, day by day, becoming a fixed point of reference for the ferries passing below. The masons worked on wooden scaffolds, spreading mortar with trowels, the scraping sound carrying over the water, the seagulls perched on the unfinished arches, watching the slow ascent of man's ambition. It was a time of patience. There were no cranes that could lift a ton in seconds. There were steam hoists, engines that chugged and hissed, winding thick hemp ropes around drums to lift the blocks. The motion was slow, up, 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 swaying gently in the breeze before being lowered with precision into place. The click of the stone settling, the tap of the hammer adjusting its position, This was the heartbeat of the bridge. As the Brooklyn Tower reached its full height, it stood like a sentinel over the low rooftops of the borough. It was solid, immovable, a testament to permanence in a changing world. And across the shimmering water, the Manhattan Tower was beginning its own journey down into the earth and up into the sky. The twin giants were being born, separated by the river, waiting for the day they would be joined. The sun would set over the harbor, casting long golden reflections on the water. The work would cease for the night. The steam engines would wind down, hissing their last breaths of vapor. The workers would pile onto the ferries, tired and silent, heading home to their warm dinners. The river would reclaim the silence, the water lapping against the granite base of the towers, flowing past the caissons, whispering the secrets of the tide. The city slept, but the bridge, in its infancy, stood watch, a dream of steel and stone, waiting for the morning light to continue its slow, inevitable climb toward the heavens. The river, though ancient and indifferent to the ambitions of men, seemed to hold a specific grudge against the Manhattan side. While the Brooklyn Tower had found its footing on the solid rock of the earth with relative grace, the Manhattan Tower required a journey into a deeper, more stubborn darkness. It is here, in the shadow of the great metropolis, that the story descends further before it can rise. If you were to stand on the slippery cobblestone edge of the South Street seaport in 1871, looking out over the water, you would have seen the massive wooden caisson floating there before it was sunk. It was a fortress of timber, larger than the one in Brooklyn, designed to withstand pressures that the human body was never meant to endure. The sinking of the Manhattan caisson was a slow, heavy affair, a gradual submission to the weight of the limestone blocks piled upon its roof. Down it went, inch by agonized inch, into the quicksand. The atmosphere inside this submerged chamber was thick enough to lean against. On the Brooklyn side, they had hit bedrock at 44 feet. On the Manhattan side, the bedrock remained elusive, hidden deep beneath layers of prehistoric sand and shifting silt. They had to go deeper, 50 feet, 60 feet, 78 feet below the high tide mark. Imagine the silence of that depth, broken only by the rhythmic strike of iron sledgehammers and the hiss of compressed air valves. The air pressure down there was immense, nearly 4 atmospheres. It changed the way the world worked. If you tried to whistle, no sound would come out. The air was too dense to vibrate the lips. Voices sounded tinny and distant, as if spoken through a long metal pipe. Candles, the primary source of light in the murky gloom, burned with a terrifying ferocity. The flames would eat through the wax in minutes, casting long, frantic shadows against the slimy, mud-coated walls. When a candle was blown out, the wick would often reignite spontaneously, a ghost flame born of the oxygen-rich air. It was in this hyper-pressurized twilight that the great blowout occurred, a moment of sudden, muffled violence that felt like a cannon firing into a pillow. The water from the river, fighting the compressed air, found a weakness. A geyser of mud and water shot 500 feet into the air above the river's surface, showering the nearby ships with debris. But down below, the men simply felt the shift in pressure, the popping of ears, the sudden terror of the river knocking at the door. Then silence returned. The air pumps chugged on, reestablishing the equilibrium, pushing the river back with the invisible hand of physics. But the greatest danger was not the water, it was the fire. One evening, A candle's flame, perhaps brushed against the ceiling by a careless shoulder, caught the oakum caulking between the massive yellow pine timbers. In the oxygen-soaked air, the timber did not burst into flames. It glowed. The fire ate its way upward, deep into the 12-foot thick solid wood roof of the caisson. It was a hidden, smoldering cancer, invisible from the inside. Washington Roebling, the man carrying his father's dream in his mind, fought this silent enemy for hours. He was down in the muck, directing the men. They drilled holes into the roof to find the fire, but it had spread too far. The smoke was suffocating, a dense, acrid cloud that smelled of burning pine tar and desperation. There was only one solution, a surrender that felt like defeat but was actually salvation. They had to flood the caisson. Imagine the calmness of that decision. The order was given. The air compressors were silenced. The valves were opened. And the East River, which they had spent years fighting to keep out, was invited in. The water rushed into the chamber, swirling and rising, extinguishing the candles, covering the tools, drowning the mud. It rose until it touched the roof, filling every crack and crevice, smothering the red-hot embers deep within the wood. The caisson lay silent and full of water for days, a sunken cathedral of timber resting in the cold embrace of the Atlantic tide. When they pumped it out days later, the wood was scarred but solid. They filled the burnt cavities with cement, a bandage of stone for the wooden heart at the bridge. However, the depth exacted a price that cement could not fix. As the caisson went deeper, the men began to fall. They called it the bends, or caisson disease. It was a mystery then, a terrifying affliction that struck when men returned to the surface too quickly. The nitrogen gas, dissolved in their blood under the immense pressure, would bubble out like a shaken bottle of soda when they reached the open air. It started as a dull ache in the joints, a heaviness in the limbs. For some, it became an agony so sharp they could only curl into balls on the floor of the changing rooms. For Washington Roebling, it was the end of his physical strength. He had spent more time in the compressed air than anyone, driven by a relentless need to see every bolt and beam himself. One afternoon, after ascending from the depths, the pain seized him. It was a paralysis that stole his ability to walk, to visit the site, to stand amidst the dust and noise. He was carried to his home in Brooklyn Heights, to the room with the bay window overlooking the river. And there, the history shifts from the mud of the river bottom to the quiet intimacy of a sick room. The bridge builder became a recluse. The noise of the city, the ferry whistles, the carriage wheels, the distant shout of newsboys filtered through the glass, but he could no longer join the chorus. This is where the story finds its most tender and surprising hero. Enter Emily Warren Roebling. She was not an engineer. She was a woman of Victorian society, accustomed to tea parlors and silk dresses. But as her husband lay in bed, racking with pain, his mind still racing with stress loads and cable tension, she realized that for the bridge to rise, she would have to become his voice. It was a slow, quiet transformation. Picture the evenings in that high-ceilinged room. The gas lamps would be turned low. Washington, pale and weak, would dictate instructions. Emily sat by his bedside, a notebook in her lap, her pen moving gracefully across the paper. At first, she merely transcribed. But soon, she began to ask questions. Why this curve? What is the breaking strength of this wire? How does the catenary absorb the wind? She began to study. While the city slept, Emily Roebling pored over books on higher mathematics, strength of materials, and cable construction. She learned the language of steel and stone. She learned to read the complex blueprints that covered the tables. She became the first female field engineer in history. Though she held no official title, every morning she would dress in her long skirts and button boots and cross the river to the job site. The rough men, the masons, the wire spinners, the foremen with calloused hands learned to respect the sight of her. She did not shout. She brought instructions from the colonel, as Washington was known, but she delivered them with her own understanding. She answered their questions. She spotted errors. She became the living link between the mind of the invalid in the tower window and the hands of the workers in the sky. Under her watch, the towers finished their climb. By 1876, the granite giants were complete. They stood 278 feet above the water, the tallest structures in the Western Hemisphere. They were stark, beautiful, and imposing. The arches, shaped like the windows of a Gothic church, framed the sky and the city beyond. From the top of the towers, New York looked like a toy village. The ships were mere specks on a ribbon of gray water. The wind up there was all constant, a pure, clean breeze that swept away the smoke of the factories below. The time had come to connect them. The bridge needed its cables, the steel tendons that would hold the roadway. But how do you get the first line across a river teeming with ships, with currents that could drag a boat halfway to the ocean? You do not swim it. You do not row it. You carry it across the sky. On a warm August day in 1876, the harbor fell silent to watch a spectacle. A small scow, a flat-bottomed boat, laid a wire rope on the riverbed from Brooklyn to Manhattan. Then, utilizing steam engines on the towers, they hoisted this wire up from the water. It dripped wet and muddy as it rose higher and higher until it snapped taut, high above the masts of the passing ships. It was a thin, trembling line of steel, the width of a man's thumb, etched against the blue summer sky. It was called the traveler rope. It was the thread that would pull the heavier cables across. But to prove it was safe, to show the world that this spiderweb could hold the weight of a nation, someone had to ride it. Frank Farrington, the master mechanic, volunteered. Imagine the courage, the utter calmness required for such a feat. They rigged a bosun's chair, essentially a wooden plank suspended by 4 ropes, to the traveler wire. Farrington sat on the plank, dangling hundreds of feet above the churning river. He was not tied in. He simply held on. As the steam engine engaged, he began to move. He glided out from the Brooklyn Tower, sliding down the long, graceful curve of the wire toward the center of the river. The wind buffeted at him. The seagulls circled him, confused by this wingless bird. Below him, the captains of the ferries blew their whistles in a deafening salute. The crowds lining the shores of Brooklyn and Manhattan erupted into cheers, a roar that rolled across the water like thunder. But Farrington did not look down in terror. He looked calm. As he reached the lowest point of the sag, suspended over the middle of the East River, he waved his hat to the crowd. He was floating in the void, a solitary figure suspended between 2 cities, between the past and the future. Then the engine pulled him up the other side, ascending toward the Manhattan Tower. When he stepped onto the stone coping of the Manhattan Tower, he had done more than cross a river. He had stitched the city together. The air was electric with possibility. The 2 islands, isolated by ice and tide since the beginning of time, were now linked by a single strand of steel. Back in his room, watching through a telescope, Washington Roebling saw the tiny dot of the man cross the wire. He lowered the glass, a look of quiet satisfaction on his face. Beside him, Emily organized the papers for the next day. The stone was done. The wire was strung. Now began the spinning. The spinning of the cables is a hypnotic, repetitive dance that would take years. It was not a construction of brute force, but of infinite patience. They were not hanging thick, pre-made cables. They were creating them in midair. A carrier wheel, like a bicycle wheel on a pulley, would travel back and forth across the river, unspooling the steel wire as it went. Back and forth, like a giant loom weaving a steel carpet for the clouds. Each wire was as thin as a pencil, but they would lay thousands of them, side by side, strand by strand. The days turned into seasons. The winter snows coated the unfinished cables in white, making them look like frosted garlands. The summer sun heated the steel until it was too hot to touch without gloves. The carrier wheels whirred rhythmically, a mechanical lullaby that played from dawn until dusk. Whir, click, the men working on the catwalks, narrow wooden footbridges suspended alongside the cables, were sailors, accustomed to heights and the sway of the deck. They walked with the confidence of tightrope walkers. They bundled the wires together, compressing them into tight cylinders. They wrapped them in soft wire to protect them from the elements. They were creating the four main cables, the muscles of the bridge, each one eventually growing to be nearly 16 inches in diameter. It was a slow accumulation of strength. From the streets below, the cables looked delicate, almost ethereal, shimmering in the sunlight. But up close, they were cold, hard, and unyielding. They captured the light of the sunsets, glowing red and orange long after the streets below had fallen into shadow. As the years of the late 1870s passed, the bridge became a fixture of the skyline, even in its unfinished state. It was always there, looming, watching. The people of New York and Brooklyn grew used to the sight of the tiny figures walking the wires high above. It became a clock by which they set their lives. The morning whistle of the bridge work meant the day had begun. The evening silence meant rest. And in the quiet house in Brooklyn Heights, the partnership continued. Emily Roebling was no longer just delivering messages. She was negotiating contracts. She was dealing with politicians who wanted to cut funding. She was soothing the egos of rival engineers who were jealous of her husband's genius. She moved through the world of men with a grace that disarmed them and a knowledge that silenced them. She was the guardian of the bridge. One evening, a severe storm rolled in from the Atlantic. Thunder rattled the window panes of the Roebling house. The rain lashed against the glass in sheets. Washington worried about the temporary footbridges, the fragile wooden catwalks swaying in the gale. He watched through the darkness, waiting for a lightning flash to illuminate the scene. When the lightning came, it lit up the harbor in a stark, blue-white brilliance. And there it was, the web of steel, holding fast. The cables swayed, yes, but they did not break. They danced with the wind, just as John Roebling had predicted they would. The diagonal stays, the complex geometry of the design, held the structure steady against the fury of the storm. The storm passed, leaving behind a washed-clean morning. The air was crisp. The river was calm, reflecting the blue of the sky. The bridge had survived the test of the elements. It was ready for the next phase, the hanging of the suspenders, the vertical ropes that would hold the floor where the people would walk. The skeleton was complete. Now it needed a body. The city waited, holding its breath, as the dream moved slowly toward reality. The river flowed on, its power finally being tamed, not by force, but by the quiet persistence of wire, stone, and the mind of a woman standing by a window. By the autumn of 1878, the sky between the two cities had changed. Where once there was only air and the cry of gulls, there now hung 4 massive cables, thick and dark against the clouds. They were no longer the trembling wires of the early days. They were solid cylinders of steel, each one nearly 16 inches in diameter, wrapped tight in a protective skin of soft, zinc-coated wire to ward off the salt air. To the commuters on the ferries below, they looked like the vines of some colossal industrial jungle, draped with a lazy grace from the granite towers. The spinning was done, but the hanging had just begun. It is difficult to overstate the patience required for what came next. A suspension bridge is, in essence, a hammock. The main cables are the ropes tied to the trees, but the deck, the part where people and horses actually travel, does not sit on the cables. It hangs from them. To achieve this, the workers had to attach suspender ropes. These were vertical steel cables, spaced exactly 7.5 feet apart, dropping down from the main cables like the teeth of a giant comb. Imagine the view from the catwalks on a misty Tuesday morning in November. The river below is a slate-gray mirror, broken only by the wake of a steam tug towing a barge of coal. The city of New York is waking up, the chimneys of the tenements puffing their first smoke of the day. Up on the cables, the workers, bundled in heavy wool coats and flat caps, are clamping iron bands around the main cables. These are called cable bands. They are the knuckles of the bridge. From each band, a wire rope is lowered. It unspools slowly, spinning slightly in the breeze until it dangles at the precise height needed to hold the floor beams. Because the main cable dips in a curve, the catenary, and the road must be relatively flat with a slight camber, every single suspender rope had to be cut to a different specific mathematical length. The ones near the towers were long, stretching down nearly 300 feet. The ones in the center of the river were short, barely a few feet long. Washington Roebling, sitting in his chair by the window in Brooklyn Heights, had calculated the length of every single one of these ropes years before. He had done it in his head and on paper, accounting for the stretch of the steel, the weight of the deck, and even the temperature of the air on the day they would be hung. If a rope was too short by an inch, the deck would ripple. If it was too long, the load would be uneven. It was a symphony of arithmetic played out with steel wire. As the suspenders were hung, the bridge began to look like a harp. The wind would catch these vertical wires, and while they did not make a sound the human ear could easily hear from the shore, the vibration was there, a low, humming thrum that resonated through the ironwork. The bridge was beginning to sing its own song, a deep baritone note of tension and balance. However, in the quiet accounting rooms of the bridge company, a crisis was brewing that threatened to snap the entire project. It was a scandal of silence and steel. The contract for the steel wire had been awarded to a man named J. Lloyd Hay. He was a Brooklyn manufacturer, a man with a warehouse and a reputation. But Hay was cutting corners. He knew the specifications were rigorous, Every batch of wire was tested for strength before it left the factory. To bypass this, his team began a calm, systematic fraud. They would have the inspectors test a wagon load of good wire. Once the inspectors stamped it as approved and went to lunch, Hayes' men would switch the good wire for bad wire, brittle, rejected steel that had failed the tests, and ship the bad wire to the bridge. The good wire would then be wheeled back into the warehouse to be tested again the next day. It was a shell game played with the lives of thousands. The deception was discovered not with a dramatic raid, but through the quiet diligence of the bridge's own engineers who noticed the discrepancy in the weight of the deliveries. When the news reached Washington Roebling, he did not explode in anger. The stress would have killed him in his weakened state. Instead, he reacted with the cold, hard logic of a master builder. He could have ordered the cables torn down. It would have delayed the bridge by years, bankrupted the company, and humiliated the city. Instead, he did the math. He calculated exactly how much weaker the bad wire was. He determined the percentage of the cable that was compromised, and then he calmly ordered the addition of more wire. He instructed the workers to add extra strands to the cables, thickening them beyond the original design. He added a safety margin so immense, 6 times the strength actually needed, that even with the rotten wire hidden deep inside the bundles, the bridge would never fall. He buried the mistake under layers of fresh, strong steel. It was a pragmatic American solution. Do not tear it down. Make it stronger. The bad wire remains there to this day, entombed in the heart of the cables, a silent secret held by the bridge, neutralized by the redundancy of Roebling's genius. With the crisis averted, the work turned to the floor. This was the moment the bridge ceased to be a drawing and became a place. The floor beams were made of steel, not iron. This was a revolutionary choice. In the 1870s, steel was the new material, expensive and difficult to forge in large quantities. The Bessemer process was just making it viable. Roebling had fought for steel because it was lighter and stronger. As the beams were hoisted up from the scows in the river, swinging gently on the derrick ropes, they were riveted into place. Clang, clang, clang. The sound of the riveting was the new heartbeat of the harbor. A rivet is a metal pin heated until it is glowing red-hot, soft as clay. It is pushed through holes into steel beams. Then a man with a hammer strikes the other end, flattening it into a mushroom shape. As the rivet cools, it shrinks, pulling the two beams together with a grip tighter than any screw. It is a permanent bond. Day by day, the floor extended out from the towers. It did not start from the shores. It started from the towers and grew outward in both directions, toward the land and toward the center of the river. It looked like two diving boards reaching for each other. The winter of 1880 was harsh, but the work continued. The men wore heavy woolen pea coats and greased their boots with tallow to keep out the wet. They walked on the narrow steel beams, hundreds of feet above the ice floes, with a casual indifference that terrified the onlookers on the ferries. They were skywalkers. They chewed tobacco and shouted jokes over the wind, their breath steaming. To them, the bridge was not a monument. It was a job. It was a paycheck. And then the two ends met. It happened in the middle of the span. The steel from Brooklyn reached out and touched the steel from Manhattan. The holes aligned. The red-hot rivets were driven home. The structure became one continuous ribbon. For the first time, a shadow was cast across the entire width of the East River, but Roebling had one more design element that would make this bridge unique in all the world. He did not just want to move bodies. He wanted to move souls. Most bridges of the time were purely functional: trains, horses, carts. Pedestrians were an afterthought, forced to walk in the mud or smoke alongside the animals. Roebling designed something different: an elevated promenade. He raised the center of the bridge, creating a boardwalk 5 feet above the roadway. It was a highway in the sky, dedicated solely to people. It was a democratic gesture. He wrote that on this promenade, the old and the young, the rich and the poor, may stroll together and breathe the pure air of the Atlantic. It was a calm, deliberate space for leisure, rising above the manure of the horses and the soot of the coal carts. The decking for the promenade was laid with yellow pine, laid in a herringbone pattern. It was smooth and fragrant. The railing was high enough to feel safe, but open enough to see the world. From this vantage point, one could see the curvature of the earth. One could see the ships sailing out to the ocean, bound for London, for Hong Kong, for places the workers would never see. The bridge brought the horizon to the people. Throughout 1881 and 1882, the trusswork was added. These were the diagonal steel beams that ran along the sides of the deck. They stiffened the bridge, preventing it from twisting in the wind. This was the final piece of the stiffness puzzle. The bridge now had 3 systems keeping it stable. 1, weight. The sheer heaviness of the roadway kept it still. 2, the stays. The diagonal cables that fanned out from the towers like rays of sunlight, holding the floor steady. 3, the trusses. The steel lattice along the sides. It was a fortress against the wind. It was designed to withstand a hurricane that hadn't happened yet. While the men hammered the steel, Emily Roebling was fighting the battles on the ground. The trustees of the bridge, politicians and financiers, were growing impatient. The bridge was taking too long. It was costing too much. Eventually, $15 million, a staggering sum. There were whispers that Washington Roebling was insane, that he was a phantom, that he didn't exist. They wanted to replace him. Emily attended the meetings. She was the only woman in the room, surrounded by men in waistcoats with mutton chop whiskers, the smoke of their cigars filling the air. She spoke with a calm, terrifying precision. She explained the delay. She explained the catenary curves and the sheer strength of the rivets. She quoted the engineering journals. She defended her husband's position with such technical mastery that the politicians were stunned into silence. They realized that firing Washington meant firing her, and without her, they didn't know how to finish the bridge. The motion to remove him was defeated. The Iron Woman had saved the bridge again. As the physical structure neared completion, a new marvel was added: electricity. This was the dawn of the electric age. Thomas Edison had just opened his Pearl Street station in Manhattan. The Brooklyn Bridge was to be one of the first major public structures to be lit by electric light. Before this, streets were lit by gas, dim, flickering yellow flames. The bridge was fitted with arc lamps. These were not the soft bulbs we know today. They were brilliant, sputtering balls of blue-white fire created by electricity jumping between 2 carbon rods. When they were turned on for a test, the bridge didn't just glow, it blazed. It looked like a necklace of diamonds draped across the velvet throat of the night. The pilots of the riverboats complained They said the lights were too bright, that they blinded them as they navigated the dark waters below. The city had to adjust the shielding. It was a problem of the future colliding with the past. The bridge was a time machine, pulling New York from the era of wood and gas into the era of steel and electricity. By the spring of 1883, the bridge was silent. The hammers had stopped. The spinning wheels were gone. The debris was cleared. It hung there, a completed thought, waiting for the word to be given. It was a strange, suspended moment in history. The ferries were still packed, the people still craning their necks to look up at the underbelly of the monster. They could see the slatting of the floorboards, the rivets counting out the distance. Washington Roebling sat in his window, the telescope pressed to his eye. He watched the wind catch the suspenders. He watched the shadows of the clouds move across the promenade. He saw his wife walking out onto the span, her skirts billowing in the wind, inspecting the railing. She was the first person to truly cross it in its finished state. Tradition says that a week before the opening, Emily Roebling took a carriage ride across the bridge to test it. She did not go alone. In her lap, she carried a rooster. It was a symbol of victory, a nod to an old superstition. The horse's hooves clattered on the new wooden planks, clop, 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 a hollow, lonely sound on the empty bridge. The carriage rolled smoothly. The bridge did not sway. The rooster did not crow. It simply watched the river passing below. She reached the Manhattan side, turned the carriage around, and came back. The bridge held. It was ready. The invitation cards were printed, engraved on heavy cream cardstock. The President of the United States, Chester A. Arthur, was scheduled to attend. The Governor of New York, Grover Cleveland, would be there. The city was buying flags. The bunting was being sewn. The fireworks were being stacked on the barges, but before the noise of the celebration, there was this final deep breath. The bridge stood alone in the moonlight, a vast, empty stage. The cables cooled in the night air, contracting slightly with a metallic groan that only the watchman heard. The river water slapped against the stone caissons, the same rhythm it had beaten for 1,000 years. But now it flowed past a conqueror. The calm history of the construction was over. The chaotic history of the bridge as a living artery of New York was about to begin. The sleeping giant was about to wake up. The dawn of May 24th, 1883, did not break like an ordinary morning. It arrived with the weight of a coronation. The sky over the harbor was a pale, washed-out blue, innocent of the coal smoke that usually choked the horizon, as if the factories themselves had decided to hold their breath. The Great East River Bridge, as it was then known, stood silent and empty for the last time, its new timber floorboards swept clean, its steel cables humming in the cool spring breeze. It was the day the two cities would finally touch. To understand the magnitude of this moment for the American soul, one must realize that New York and Brooklyn were still separate twin cities, rivals across the water. Brooklyn was the city of homes and churches. New York was the city of commerce and spires. The bridge was not merely a road, it was a wedding band of steel. By mid-morning, the silence of the dawn had been replaced by the low, continuous roar of humanity. It was a sound like the ocean, a massive, collective murmur of anticipation. The streets leading to the bridge, Broadway on the Manhattan side, Sand Street on the Brooklyn side, were rivers of black wool and silk. Men in derby hats and women in bustled dresses pressed against the police barricades. The The rooftops were crowded with spectators, looking like flocks of birds perched on the eaves. The decorations were resplendent. Every ship in the harbor, from the smallest tugboat to the massive warships of the North Atlantic Squadron, was dressed in signal flags. The USS Tennessee, the USS Yantic, and the USS Kearsarge lay at anchor below the span, their cannons primed for the salute. The bridge itself was draped in bunting, the red, white, and blue fabrics snapping sharply in the wind against the gray granite of the towers. The official ceremony began not on the bridge, but at City Hall in Manhattan. The President of the United States, Chester A. Arthur, a man of distinct whiskers and dignified girth, stepped out into the sunlight. He was joined by Grover Cleveland, the governor of New York, a man of equal stature. They climbed into open carriages, the horses' coats gleaming with polish, their harnesses jingling. The procession moved slowly toward the bridge entrance. The 7th Regiment, the pride of New York's militia, marched in lockstep, their bayonets creating a river of glittering steel that flowed down Broadway, left, right, left, right. The rhythmic thud of thousands of boots on the cobblestones was a hypnotic percussion that underpinned the cheers of the crowd. At the entrance to the bridge, the carriages stopped. This was a symbolic gesture. The president and the governor would not ride across. They would walk. They would feel the bridge beneath their feet. As President Arthur stepped onto the wooden promenade, a signal flag dropped from the Manhattan Tower. Immediately, the harbor erupted. The cannons of the warships fired in succession, boom, 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 puffing white smoke that drifted lazily over the water. The steam whistles of 1,000 factories, tugs, and ferries blew at once, a discordant but joyous chord that vibrated in the chests of the spectators. But up on the promenade, high above the noise, the walk was surprisingly calm. The president strolled. He touched the railing. He looked up at the web of suspender ropes slicing the sky. The promenade, elevated above the roadway, offered a sensation of flight. To the right, the Statue of Liberty was not yet standing. Her pedestal was still being built. But the harbor was alive with the sails of schooners and the smoke of steamers. The delegation reached the center of the span, the exact point where the suspended floor beams of New York met the suspended floor beams of Brooklyn. There, they were met by the mayor of Brooklyn and a brass band. The wind up there was fresh and salty. It whipped the coattails of the politicians. They shook hands, a simple gesture that officially ended the isolation of Long Island from the mainland. However, the most poignant moment of the day did not happen in public. It happened in a quiet room in Brooklyn Heights, overlooking the river. After the speeches were concluded at the Brooklyn terminal, speeches that went on for hours, filled with Latin phrases and flowery Victorian rhetoric about science and progress, the president made a detour. He did not go to the banquet immediately. He went to the house of Colonel Washington Roebling. The streets of Brooklyn Heights were lined with cheering crowds, but the house on Columbia Heights was a sanctuary of quiet. Washington Roebling, the man who had built the bridge but had not set foot on it for years, lay in his room. He was too weak to attend the ceremony. He had watched the procession through his telescope, a solitary figure witnessing his own triumph from a distance. When President Arthur entered the room, the silence was heavy with respect. The president, the most powerful man in the country, walked over to the invalid engineer and took his hand. He thanked him. It was a brief meeting, unrecorded by the newspapers of the day in detail, but it was the true completion of the bridge. The Iron Woman, Emily Roebling, stood by her husband's side, the unrecognized architect of this moment. She hosted the reception, moving among the generals and politicians with the grace of a queen, the only person in the room who knew every bolt and wire of the structure outside. As night fell, the bridge transformed again. This was the age of gaslight, but the bridge was a creature of the future. The arc lamps, strung along the span like pearls, flickered to life. For the first time, a ribbon of electric light connected the two dark masses of the cities. Then came the fireworks. It was a display such as the United States had never seen. Rockets were launched from the center of the span, exploding in showers of gold, green, and crimson. The colors reflected in the black water of the East River, creating a double spectacle, one in the air, one in the water. The smoke from the fireworks mingled with the mist, turning the bridge into an ethereal, glowing phantom. People watched from their rooftops, from the windows of tenements, from the decks of boats. It was a moment of collective wonder, a shared dream of what America could build. But history is not always a steady climb. Sometimes it stumbles. The calmness of the opening week was shattered 6 days later on May 30th, 1883. It was Memorial Day, then called Decoration Day. The bridge was open to the public, and the novelty was intense. For a penny, pedestrians could walk across. It was the thing to do. The afternoon was warm and pleasant. The promenade was packed with strollers, families in their Sunday best, laborers enjoying the holiday, children running along the wooden planks. There were approximately 20,000 people on the bridge that afternoon. The mood was festive, relaxed, a slow-moving river of humanity enjoying the view. The trouble began at the flight of stairs on the Manhattan side. The promenade, though wide, had narrow choke points where the stairs descended to the street level. A woman, whose name is lost to history, was walking down the wooden steps. She tripped. It was a simple, clumsy moment. She fell, perhaps twisting her ankle. A second woman, seeing her fall, screamed. In the confined acoustic space of the stairway, that scream echoed. It was sharp, terrified. In 1883, the public was still deeply suspicious of suspension bridges. They were new. They looked fragile. The idea of hanging a road on wires seemed unnatural to many. The fear was always there, lurking just beneath the surface of the wonder. When the second woman screamed, someone in the crowd, misinterpreting the sound, shouted the words that would turn a sunny afternoon into a nightmare. "The bridge is falling!" The rumor moved faster than the wind. It rippled through the crowd like an electric shock. "The bridge is falling. The cables are snapping. It's collapsing." Panic, the oldest and most irrational of human instincts, took hold. The calm stroll turned into a stampede. Thousands of people, terrified that the floor was about to drop out from under them, began to run. But there was nowhere to go. The stairs were narrow. The promenade was fenced in. People pushed forward, driven by the phantom fear of a collapse that wasn't happening. The bridge was perfectly stable. The steel cables, with their six-fold safety factor, did not even groan under the weight. The structure was indifferent to the chaos. It held firm, but the people did not know that. In the crush at the stairs, bodies piled up. Hats, parasols, and shoes were trampled. The air was filled with screams and the terrible, muffled sound of a crowd pressing in on itself. Men climbed up the diagonal stay cables to escape the crush, clinging to the wires like sailors in a storm. The police, stationed at the towers, tried to stem the tide, but the wave of fear was too strong. It lasted only minutes, but the damage was done. 12 people died in the crush, scores were injured. Blood stained the new yellow pine floorboards. The bridge, which had opened with such glory, was now christened in tragedy. The city went into mourning. The flags that had flown in celebration were lowered to half-staff. A hush fell over the river. The bridge stood accused. Was it safe? That was the question on every set of lips in New York. The engineers knew it was. Washington Roebling knew it was. The math was perfect. The tragedy had been caused by human fear, not structural failure. But the public trust is a fragile thing, far more brittle than steel. For weeks, the bridge remained a place of unease. People walked it, but they walked quickly, eyes darting to the cables, listening for the snap of a wire that would never come. The calming rhythm of the commute had been broken. To restore the calm, to prove to the people of the United States that this bridge was a permanent part of the earth, a demonstration was needed. It had to be something so heavy, so undeniable, that no one could question the strength of the span again. This brings us to the quiet, bizarre solution that was proposed in the wake of the panic. It did not come from an engineer, but from a showman. P.T. Barnum, the famous circus owner, had been watching the bridge with a keen eye. He owned a creature that was the embodiment of heavy, crushing weight. Jumbo, the African elephant. Jumbo was a celebrity in his own right, a massive beast standing over 11 feet tall, weighing nearly 7 tons. Barnum had offered to march Jumbo across the bridge on opening day, but the bridge trustees, dignified and serious men, had refused, thinking it would turn the solemn event into a circus. But now, after the panic, the mood had changed. The public needed reassurance. They needed to see that the bridge could hold not just a crowd of people, but a parade of giants. Barnum renewed his offer. He would not just bring Jumbo, he would bring the entire herd. It was a surreal proposition. The bridge, built with the highest calculus and the finest steel, would be tested by the oldest beasts on earth. The engineers, usually men of slide rules and logic, nodded their assent. They knew that elephants were known for their instinct. Folklore said an elephant would never step on an unsound structure. If the elephants walked, the people would believe. And so the stage was set for the final act of the bridge's birth. The panic had cleared the air, leaving a strange vibrating silence over the East River. The city waited. The bridge, solid and stoic, waited. The summer heat began to settle on New York. The humidity rose, turning the sky a hazy white. The river moved sluggishly below, the tides pulling at the pilings. The tragedy of the stampede began to fade into the background, replaced by the question of the elephants. Would they cross? Would the bridge hold the rhythmic, thumping cadence of 21 elephants? It is in this anticipation that we find the bridge in the summer of 1883. It was built, it was bloodied, and now it had to be redeemed. The calmness of the structure was about to be tested against the weight of the wild. The sun set on the harbor, casting long shadows from the Gothic towers. The gas lamps flickered on one by one, a string of fireflies against the twilight. The water lapped against the stone, a soothing, repetitive sound. Slap, swish, slap, swish. The bridge slept, its great steel eyes open, waiting for the heavy tread of the giants that would grant it its final legitimacy. It was a time of pause. The chaos of construction was over. The chaos of the panic was past. What remained was the steel, the stone, and the river. The bridge was breathing, a slow metallic inhalation and exhalation, adjusting to the cooling night air. It was ready for its final test. The year turned, and the seasons settled over the East River with a heavy, predictable rhythm. The winter ice that had once blocked the ferries now drifted harmlessly beneath the soaring span of the bridge, a reminder of the obstacle that had birthed the dream. The spring rains washed the granite towers, turning the stone dark and slick, while the summer heat caused the steel cables to expand and sag ever so slightly, a breathing motion that only the engineers understood. It was in the quiet of May 1884, almost exactly 1 year after the grand opening, that the final ghost of fear was to be exorcised. The memory of the panic on the stairs still lingered in the collective mind of the public. People walked the promenade, yes, but they walked with a tentative step, their eyes darting to the suspender ropes whenever the wind picked up. They needed a sign. They needed weight. Enter Phineas Taylor Barnum. P.T. Barnum was a man who understood the American appetite for spectacle, but he also understood the physics of belief. He knew that to trust the invisible strength of the bridge, the people needed to see the impossible conquer it. He proposed a parade not of soldiers, not of dignitaries, but of the heaviest land animals on the planet. The evening of May 17, 1884, was cool and clear. The sun had dipped below the Jersey Palisades, leaving the sky a bruised purple that faded into the black of night. The gas lamps on the bridge flickered to life, casting long dancing shadows on the wooden floorboards. The city was hushed, waiting. At the Brooklyn entrance, the procession gathered. It was a scene from a dream, surreal and silent in its magnitude. There were 21 elephants. Leading them was the most famous animal in the world, Jumbo. Jumbo was a colossus, an African bush elephant of staggering proportions, standing over 11 feet tall at the shoulder and weighing nearly 7 tons. His skin was like a topographical map of an ancient land, wrinkled and gray, tough as old leather. He stood at the toll plaza, his trunk swaying gently, sniffing the salt air of the harbor. Behind him stood the rest of the herd, a gray line of massive bodies shifting their weight, their ears flapping softly against their necks with a sound like canvas sails luffing in a breeze. The order was given. The barrier was lifted. Imagine the sound. There were no bands playing this time. There were no cheering crowds, for this was a test, not a celebration. The only sound was the rhythmic, heavy thud-thud-thud of 84 massive feet striking the timber deck. Elephants walk with a peculiar rolling gait. They place their feet with a delicacy that belies their size. They're sensitive to vibrations. Folklore held that an elephant would refuse to cross an unsafe structure, that they could sense the weakness in the timber or the instability in the stone. If Jumbo refused to walk, the bridge was doomed in the eyes of the public. Jumbo did not hesitate. He stepped onto the span with a slow, deliberate confidence. The herd followed. The procession moved out over the water. The bridge, loaded with over 100 tons of moving flesh, did not groan. It did not sway violently. It simply accepted the burden. The steel cables, those spider webs of Roebling's mind, pulled tight. The stay cables, the diagonal lines that cut across the sky, held the floor rigid. To a watcher on a passing tugboat below, it must have been a hallucination, a line of prehistoric giants silhouetted against the moon, walking across the sky between Brooklyn and Manhattan. The only evidence of their passing was the slight vibration in the floorboards, a low-frequency hum that traveled up the suspender ropes and dissipated into the massive stone towers. They reached the center of the span. Jumbo paused, perhaps looking out at the Statue of Liberty, whose torch was now rising on Bedloe's Island. The wind ruffled the hair on his trunk. The water swirled 135 feet below. And then he continued. When the herd reached the Manhattan side, safe and sound, the city let out a collective breath it had been holding for a year. The bridge was not just a marvel. It was a fact. It was as solid as the bedrock it stood upon. The fear evaporated, replaced by a deep, abiding pride. With the elephants gone, the bridge settled into its true life. It became a creature of habit. The years began to accelerate, but the bridge remained the constant in a changing world. In the late 1880s and 1890s, the skyline of New York began to rise. The low brick buildings were replaced by steel-framed skyscrapers, reaching up to challenge the height of the bridge's towers. But the towers held their own. They were the old guard, the stone sentinels that had seen the city when it was young. The traffic on the bridge changed, too. The clip-clop of horses and the rumble of iron-rimmed wagon wheels gradually gave way to the hum of rubber tires and the purr of internal combustion engines. The smell of the bridge shifted from manure and hay to gasoline and exhaust, but the wind from the Atlantic always swept it clean. Washington Roebling, the invisible builder, watched it all. He remained in his house in Brooklyn Heights for many years, a recluse by choice and by circumstance. He would sit by his window, his telescope trained on the cables. He watched the seasons change the color of the bridge. He saw the cables turn white in the blizzard of 1888, a thick, heavy snow that paralyzed the city but could not stop the bridge. He saw the sun bleach the wood of the promenade to a silver gray. He watched the people. He saw lovers meet on the promenade at sunset. He saw suicides, tragic and lonely, leaping into the void. He saw children playing tag around the benches. He saw the life of the city flowing through the artery he had built. Emily Roebling, the woman who had been his voice, became a figure of society traveling and writing, but her heart remained with the bridge. When she passed away in 1903, the bridge stood as her monument, as much as his. Washington lived on until 1926, passing away at the age of 89. He had outlived his father, his wife, and the era of the horse. He died knowing that his work would stand for centuries. Now, let us drift to the bridge as it stands today, or perhaps in a timeless night that encompasses all its history. Imagine standing on the promenade at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday in late autumn. The city that never sleeps has finally dozed off. The roar of the traffic has dulled to a distant rhythmic whisper, like the breathing of a sleeping giant. The skyscrapers of Lower Manhattan, the Freedom Tower, the Woolworth Building, the Gary, are lit up, a canyon of artificial crystals reflecting in the black water. But on the bridge, it is dark and calm. The wooden planks of the promenade have been replaced, but the feeling is the same. The wind is colder here, higher up. It sings through the wire mesh of the fencing. If you place your hand on one of the suspender ropes, you can feel it. It is cold, smooth steel, painted over 100 times. You can feel the vibration of the cars passing below on the roadway. It is a steady thrum, thrum, thrum. It is not a shaking. It is a pulse. The bridge is alive. The cables, those massive bundles of wire that were spun with such agonizing slowness in the 1870s, are still there holding the line. They're wrapped in their protective casings, looking like the roots of a great banyan tree turned upside down. They loop over the tops of the towers, resting in the iron saddles that allow them to slide back and forth with the temperature. Look at the towers. The granite blocks, quarried in Maine and brought down by a schooner, are rough to the touch. They are pitted by time and weather, but they are unyielding. They are the color of old parchment in the moonlight. The Gothic arches, shaped like church windows, frame the sky. They are the gates to the city, silent and imposing. Below, the East River flows with its eternal indifference. The tide is going out. The water is black and oily, swirling around the base of the stone caissons. Deep down in the mud, in the wooden boxes where the men dug and sweated and bled, there is silence. The concrete that filled the caissons has turned to stone. The timber, preserved by the lack of oxygen in the mud, sits there in the dark, the wooden feet of the stone giant. The bridge has become a place of meditation. It is a space between worlds. It is suspended between Brooklyn and Manhattan, between the sky and the water, between the past and the future. As you walk toward the center of the span, the city falls away. You're floating. The lights of the cars below are just ribbons of red and white, blurring into a long exposure photograph. The sound of a tugboat's horn, a low, mournful blast, echoes off the bottom of the deck and rolls out toward the Statue of Liberty. The fog begins to roll in from the Narrows. It is a soft gray blanket that tucks the city in. It swirls around the tops of the bridge towers, obscuring the stars. The bridge seems to detach from the land, becoming a ship sailing through the clouds. The calm is absolute. The anxiety of the construction, the pain of the bends, the fire in the caisson, the panic of the stampede, all of it has been absorbed by the stone. The history has settled like silt on the riverbed. What remains is the structure. It is a testament to patience. It took 14 years to build. It took lives. It took the health of its creator, but it was built to last forever. John Roebling's dream of a harpa eolica, a wind harp, was true. The bridge catches the wind and turns it into stability. Close your eyes and listen to the bridge. The wind whistling softly through the cables. Whoosh, whoosh, the tires on the asphalt below. The water lapping against the pilings. Splash, hush. It is a lullaby of steel and stone. The United States has changed around it. Wars have been fought. Presidents have come and gone. The horse gave way to the car, the telegraph to the internet, but the Brooklyn Bridge remains. It is the anchor. And as the night deepens and the fog thickens, the bridge seems to sleep. The tension in the cables is balanced, a perfect equilibrium of forces. Gravity pulls down. The cables pull up. The towers push down. The earth pushes back. It is a standstill, a frozen moment of physics held in place for 150 years. The rivets, driven in red hot by men in wool caps, are cool now. The limestone blocks, piled on the caissons to sink them, are part of the river bottom. The wire, spun by the carrier wheels, is still. There is a profound peace in knowing that something so heavy can be so light. that something so complex can be so simple, that a bridge built by human hands can feel as permanent as a mountain the night wears on. The first hint of gray touches the eastern horizon out toward the Atlantic. But for now, the city sleeps. The boroughs are quiet, and the great bridge, the old silent guardian of the harbor, stands watch. It holds the two islands together in its strong steel hands, gently, firmly, forever. The river flows on. The mist settles. The silence is complete. The bridge sleeps. And so too does the city. Good night.